Hi to everyone who's already joined. Just to let you know, we're waiting for maybe a couple of more minutes for more people to join, because I can see the numbers are ticking up still. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to kick off. I know lots of people are still joining us, but we've got quite a few there already. My name is Ute Collier. I'm the Deputy Director of the Knowledge Policy and Finance Center of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. And I'm pleased to welcome you today for what's the second of our webinar series on environmental impacts of renewables. So this is a series we kicked off about a month ago. Each time we're partnering with other organizations who have specific expertise in areas related to environmental impacts. So I'm pleased that today we're doing this jointly with Raptors MOU from the Convention on Migratory Species. And we will explain a lot more about the convention, about Raptors MOU. We'll have a scene setting presentation as well. So you will get lots of information that way. And then we have an expert panel, and I will introduce the panelists later when I moderate the session. But I think we're going to get a number of very interesting perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to this. I mean, in terms of us at IRENA, I mean, as you know, we are promoting the scale up of renewables because we think that's the only way we're going to achieve the 1.5 degree climate goal. And as part of this scale up, we're going to need a massive increase, not only in the deployment of renewables plants, so the wind turbines and the solar panels, whatever, but also grid infrastructure. I mean, that might be to link in new renewables in sites where there is previously no power sector infrastructure. Also, I mean, as part of the energy transition, we're going to have to increase energy access in many countries where that is severely lacking. And while some of this will be off-grid, inevitably there will also be grid infrastructure expansion. I mean, we see it also in places like, say, UAE, where many of the panel are based, IRENA and Raptors MOU. So, you know, there we're suddenly seeing grid infrastructure where it's never been. Now, power lines and grids have been a problem in the past, and this is our topic today. It's about grid infrastructure and migratory birds. So it's not a new issue, and there is lots of experience in dealing with it, and there are many mitigation measures. But what we want to do with this session is actually draw attention to the fact that, you know, this is getting ever more urgent. It's a problem we've had, but with the expansion of grid infrastructure, unless we manage this carefully, this could become ever more serious. So we want to draw attention to it through this webinar series. Also, I mean, at IRENA, I'm involved in the energy task force of the CMS, which is, of course, also dealing with these issues. So we have a good collaboration already with the CMS. So I'd like to now pass over to Ruba Abu Atye, who's the executive coordinator of the CMS office in Abu Dhabi, who will tell us more. Thanks, Ruba.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for this session today. And my thanks obviously to IRENA for bringing focus to the environmental impacts of renewable energy grid infrastructure. Today's discussion couldn't be more timely, as been said, as we work to balance the urgent need for renewable energy expansion with the protection of migratory species and their habitat. So as many of you know, CMS, the Convention of Migratory Species, is dedicated to uniting countries across migratory pathways to ensure coordinated conservation measures. Under CMS, the Raptors MOU plays a pivotal role, engaging 46 signatory countries in joint action to safeguard migratory birds of prey across Africa and Eurasia. This agreement reflects how crucial cross-border efforts are in addressing threats that migratory birds face, particularly with expanding energy infrastructure. Migratory birds of prey face unique challenges on their migratory journey, often being impacted by power lines and grid structures along these routes. Collisions and electrocutions are serious threat to these species, underscoring the needs for sustainable planning that considers biodiversity. So the successful conservation efforts rely not only on cross-border collaboration, but also on the support of dedicated range states. To give you an example, the Raptors MOU's coordinating unit is based in Abu Dhabi, hosted by the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi on behalf of the government of the UAE. This support has enabled us to focus on meaningful conservation actions that align with the goals set by our signatories, helping to bring our mission to life through collaborative efforts. With countries now pledging to triple renewable capacities, the role of early planning, bird-safe infrastructure, and government engagement have never been more important. By aligning conservation priorities with energy infrastructure expansion, we can mitigate the impact on migratory birds while also enhancing the stability and sustainability of power system. So during this session, we will discuss those challenges faced by birds of prey, and I would like to thank you all for joining and being part of this essential conversation. I look forward to hearing your insights on how we can work together to address these challenges effectively. And now I will leave you with my colleague, Umberto Gallo Orsi, the coordinator of the Raptors MOU, to provide you with an overview of the impacts associated with energy infrastructure and currently available best practices and guidelines that we can implement to mitigate those impacts. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Umberto.
Thank you very much, Ruba, for this introduction, and very good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, to everybody. It's great to see such a numerous participation in this joint IRENA CMS Raptor MOU webinar. As I said, let me share my screen so I have a small slide, a set of slides that will help me through the presentation. I wonder, can you see it? Let me put it on. Yes. Okay, this way, yeah? As I said, Umberto Gallorsi, head of the coordinating unit of the Memorandum of Understanding on the Conservation of Migratory Birds of Prey in Africa and Eurasia, which is shortly called the Raptor MOU. But let me introduce first of all what is the Convention of Migratory Species, or the CMS, or Bonn Convention, which is the only international environmental treaty of the United Nations that provides a global platform for the conservation of sustainable use of migratory animals and their habitat. The headquarters is in Bonn, and the decision-making body is the Conference of the Parties. At the moment, there are 132 parties, 32 countries and the European Union, And you see in the map what is the current distribution of the partners. The migratory species threatened with extinction are listed in the CMS Appendix 1, and the parties to the convention commit to strictly protect them, so no taking allowed, conserve and restore the places where they live, mitigate all the obstacles to the migration, and control other factors that might endanger the species. On top of that, the convention encourages range states, so not only parties, to conclude global or regional agreements for the conservation of species that are listed in Appendix 2. And the two appendices are not mutually exclusive, so there are species that occur both in Appendix 1 because are globally threatened and they need specific activities, but also in Appendix 2 because they, with others, will benefit from international cooperation. One of these international cooperation is the Raptor MOU, which is a multilateral agreement, non-legally binding agreement established in 2008 with a range state of 131 states, with the geography covering all Europe, all Africa, and large part of Asia, devoted to the protection of 94 species organized in categories based on their priorities. The 63 countries has signed the MOU and the European Union. On top of the conservation of species, the MOU has identified a network of 7,000 internationally important sites for the conservation of raptors, and the signatories have committed to their protection and conservation. Again, the decision-making body is the meeting of the signatories. We also have a technical advisory body providing support to the Secretariat, and which is based here in Abu Dhabi, and to the parties and the signatories. So, but let's look at what is we are talking about today. The risk posed to birds by a growing network of overhead electrical cables was identified as early as the beginning of the 20th century, where the first bird electrocuted or that had collided with the lines were found. But the size of the issue and the actual impact on bird population emerged only over time with the increase from one side of the grid, and so the chances for a bird to hit the network, and the expansion of research studies targeting this new threat. Most of the above ground power lines, both medium voltage, so distribution line, and medium to very high voltage, so transmission lines, present potentially fatal risk for bird through collision or electrocution. So a bird collision occurs when a flying bird simply collides physically with an overhead cable, and the bird generally is killed immediately in the impact, or maybe by hitting the ground after the fall, or dies for the resulting injuries. Electrocution, on the other side, occurs when a bird bridges the gap between two energized components, or an energized and a grounded component on the pile structure. So most of the electrocution we see them are actually at the pylons or the pole. This results in a short circuit, electricity flowing through the bird's body, the bird dying mostly immediately, and electrocution is always or often accompanied by an outage on the energy supply. And in both cases, birds do not learn from this. So this is a fatal event from which there is no way that the bird can learn to avoid this kind of risk later on. The collision and the listed electrocution risk increase with the density of above ground and transmission and distribution grid. Currently, it is estimated that in the top 30 countries hosting over 80% of the grid, there are something like 7 million circuit kilometers of power transmission line and 110 million kilometers of power distribution line. So the number are already very, very high. But the predicted growth of the network is impressive, and the potential number of interactions with birds and in fact other animals, and therefore the biodiversity impact keeps growing unless solutions are implemented. The solutions we know are there. Let me look at some of them. But let me add a moment about the serious and the significance of this impact. Collision with power lines and electrocution are the major cause of human-induced death for birds, and in particular for large birds like raptors, like vultures, storks, bustard, cranes, at least in Africa, Europe, and Asia, according to a recent study published this year, in fact, on analyzing the mortality cause of satellite tagged birds. The combined energy grid-related mortality, so electrocution and collision again, represent over 40% of all human-induced mortality events, and represent in most large bird groups the most common human-induced mortality cause. So we have a problem because most of the species, most of the large-sized birds are threatened species, so are in Appendix 1 or are in the red list of the IUCN. So CMS, the African Eurasian Waterborne Agreement, another agreement established under CMS, and the Raptor MOU have been working on the impact of power lines on migratory birds for many years now, as reflected by the production and adoption and updating of several resolutions over the years. In this resolution, basically the parties are called to strengthen their legislation or bylaws, improve their strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment procedures to reduce the impact of power lines, establish a baseline of bird distribution, population size, migration and local movements as early as possible in the planning for any power line project, because the sooner we know what is happening, earlier we can avoid the impact. Develop a national sensitivity or zoning map to guide the location, route, direction of power lines. And of course, monitoring and evaluate the impact on existing power lines to react and to minimize their impact as well. The work included also the production of reviews and guidelines, and here are linked and are available, for example, in the Energy Task Force website. So the solutions are there. The cost for developing a bird-safe power line are not significantly higher than developing a normal power line. So it's not even very often an economic issue. The fact is change takes time, and changing ways of working is sometimes very slow. So the CMS has established, as I mentioned, as Ute has also mentioned, has established the Energy Task Force, which is a multi-stakeholder platform established in 2015 that works toward reconciling renewable energy developments with the conservation of migratory species. It brings together UN agencies, government, investment bank, technical experts, and NGOs to share and disseminate knowledge, best practices, and smart policies. Applications for membership are welcome and will be reviewed and approved by the members at the next meeting. So I encourage everybody who's interested to join the task force. So addressing the possible negative interaction between birds and power lines start with the proper planning and assessing the potential or actual size of the problem in terms of number and species affected. Number of birds affected and the species affected. The mitigation hierarchy, avoid, minimize, restore, and offset, should be followed, and for each step, guidance, documents, and toolkits are available. And of course, we try to stay on the highest part of the hierarchy, try to avoid in particular and minimize. Just restoring and offset is when you really kind of failed in doing the proper job. Those listed here in terms of tools are probably the most commonly used: the Transmit, the EBA, the Soaring Bird Sensitivity, AVISTEP, which is coming up and spreading across many countries. But there are many other national sensitivity maps and assessment tools that are available, and encourage everybody to look for them and use them effectively. So but let's understand one thing, that the interaction between birds and the energy grid is not simply a biodiversity issue. It is also, and as well, a problem for the energy distribution company. Collision and electrocution of animals cause an important percentage, around almost 10% of the micro-interruption in power supplies. Such disruption may cause damage to the infrastructure and equipment of the utility company, as well affect the clients in terms of quality of service, damage to their equipment, and so on, can cause, and has in fact. We have examples of starting wildfires resulting in liability for the utilities for damage to properties and good. In some countries, furthermore, like USA or Spain, for example, the utility companies may be found responsible of the death of protected species when they knew that they were affecting such protected species, legally protected species. And finally, of course, there is also an issue of public relations. More and more the public is interested on providing and getting a service which is environmental friendly. So the energy sector and the agencies dealing with the conservation of biodiversity are facing the same problem, but see it from different perspectives. The bird life or the bird people was looked at that as a bird problem, and the energy people say that as an energy problem. But it's the same problem, and we definitely need to bridge this gap and understand that only working together we can effectively and efficiently address it. Thank you very much. Ute, back to you.
Thank you very much, Umberto, for this introduction. And I mean, that was very interesting, especially I was really struck by seeing that graph on the expansion in power grids. I mean, it's kind of, I always had this in my head, but I hadn't actually seen a graph on that. So yeah, it's quite an issue. Okay, so what we're going to move on to now is a panel discussion, but what we want to do before we introduce the panel and start with some questions, we'd like some participation from the audience. So, I mean, obviously you will also have a chance to put any questions later on to the panel, and please use the Q&A function for that. But we're going to do an online poll now. So can my IRENA colleagues please launch the poll? Right, okay. I think we have 3 of those. For the first one, and you have a single choice, we'd like you to click any of these that apply. So the question is, or were you, before you heard Umberto's presentation, aware of the problem of electrocution of migratory birds by power lines and substations? Your choices are no, this is the first time I've heard about this, or I've heard about cases from the news or internet. You may have seen incidents yourself, or you're even very familiar with this issue because you deal with it in your work. Can you please click? Hosts and panelists cannot vote. Right. Okay, how are we doing? IRENA colleagues, do we have results? Okay, so we obviously have an audience of people who are very familiar with this issue. I mean, inevitably this happens with this kind of webinar. It's kind of self-selecting. So we only had 8% of people saying this is the first time they've heard about it. Some people have heard about cases more in the media, and we have about half of the people here very familiar with this issue. So great. So I expect a lot of active participation then in the Q&As as well from this very knowledgeable audience, and I look forward to that. Right, so let's kick off then with our panel. Let me first introduce everyone. So we have Oscar Mohale, who's Program Manager of Wildlife and the Wildlife and Energy Program of the Endangered Wildlife Trust based in South Africa. Richard Harness, Certified Wildlife Biologist, EDM International, based in the US. And I'm very grateful to Richard for joining us so early. I believe it's 6:25 a.m. there. Then another person to congratulate is Jie Gao, who's joining us from China very late in the day. I think it's 9:25 there. Jie works as an engineer for State Grid Corporation of China. Then we have Manon Questoy, manager of energy and nature of the Renewables Grid Initiative. And people will tell you later what specifically they're doing in these organizations. And then finally, we have Rainer Raab, who's managing partner of TB Raab. All right. So we are going to start with Richard to keep him awake, or wake him up, let's put it that way. So you're working for EDM International. I understand that this provides solutions for grid utilities, including those related to animal interactions with electric utility infrastructures. Can you, can you tell us what the typical situations are which are encountered by migratory birds with different types of grid infrastructure, transmission lines or substations or anything else? Do we actually have available solutions to deal with all these different kind of cases? Richard, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, and I appreciate being part of the panel. And I would also like to just start off by saying I think Umberto did a great job of laying out the foundation for this, so I'll just apologize up front that some of this will be a little repetitive. But I think to reiterate a little bit of what he said is that first we need to realize that these animal interactions with power lines, and I'm going to take a broader look at this, I'm not just going to focus on birds, but it's a shared problem. It's not just animals, wildlife being killed, and it is in our common interest to reduce these sorts of events to not only prevent the unnecessary take of wildlife, because I'm going to talk about a lot of solutions already exist, but it gives us an opportunity to make the system more reliable by reducing outages and diminishing stress to electrical protective equipment, and in some cases preventing wildfires, which we're seeing as a problem here that we're paying a little bit more attention to now. And to give you a bit of an example from a North American perspective, there's been some work done on what sort of impacts animals have on the electric utility grid. And EPRI did a survey of North American utilities and came up with a number around 9% of all outages are caused by animals getting into the grid, causing millions of dollars of losses. And I've got both an engineering background and a wildlife background. And I would really argue that in the electric utility industry, it's very important to control outages. And there are many things that a utility does not have control over, such as storms, but they do have control over reducing animal-caused outages. So I look at this as like there's also an opportunity, and fortunately, remedies exist. So regarding the typical situations that we would encounter as it pertains to renewables, I would actually like to start with the energy collector stations. And so I know that most of the people in the survey are showing up as being pretty advanced on this. And so most of us know that after power is generated, wind, solar, whatever it is, it needs to go to a collector station where it's stepped up. And when it goes into this station, there's a low side and a high side of that station. And collector stations sometimes have problems with animals getting into that low side where clearances are less due to the lower voltage. And what we know from looking at these stations is that there's certain pieces of equipment in there, such as breakers, bus conductors, and low side transformer bushings that are particularly susceptible. And we also know that certain substations can be more prone to animal interactions due to the surrounding habitat. And there's often a temporal component to that as well. And so for this audience, I would say that that's a piece of infrastructure that should not be overlooked. Typically, you don't have a lot of events in these facilities, but they do kill animals. And as you can well imagine, the impacts to the utility and the consumers can be quite large for things getting into these collector stations. And again, solutions are available there. And in order to prevent contacts, usually well-defined fences are used, including non-lethal fences can be used to prevent mammals and snake access. And a really key important thing in these collector stations is that they often provide nesting locations for small birds like passerines. And even though those small birds may not be big enough to create problems for you, they'll draw in other animals seeking prey. And so an active bird nest removal program is also key. And then to address the bird issues, what we try to do is to provide separation in these collector stations to basically provide enough phase-to-phase and phase-to-ground separation for the species that would likely be using them, such as things like great horned owls. And in the US, we typically are using 102 centimeters horizontal and vertical. But having said that, and this is going to be a theme throughout the electrocution issue, that even when you try to provide this separation, there are going to be some pieces of equipment that you cannot provide that separation for. So for instance, if you are ordering a breaker, you can't get the breaker with that type of separation at a distribution voltage. And so you're going to be forced to use some insulating products. And fortunately, in the US, there are over 340 commercially available products designed to mitigate animal-caused outages. And there are even several companies that specialize in providing services to completely insulate substations. And again, going back to sort of the engineering piece of this, is that there's that biological component, but the engineering is very critical. And we need to make sure that whenever we retrofit either distribution overhead lines or substations, that we realize these products are going into a very harsh environment. They're going to be subjected to ultraviolet, temperatures, hot and cold, electrical stresses. And so we need to install products that have very superior properties. And anybody that is looking to select products should reference the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And that's a big word for me to say in the morning, or IEEE. They developed a guideline for testing the electrical, mechanical, and durability performance of wildlife protective devices. And it's a standard called IEEE 1656. So that should always be consulted. So from there, we need to realize that the power isn't being transmitted to load centers via the transmission lines. And in the US, we would define a transmission line as 60 kVs or higher. And as Umberto already mentioned, there are typically the issues associated with birds. There would be wire collisions, but utilities will also be faced with nesting issues and fecal contamination and fecal streamer issues as well. And as he alluded to, methods for limiting these types of interactions starts with avoidance using GIS sensitivity maps. And then from there, you can actually select some designs that might have lower risk, such as lower or configurations, such as vertical. And what we know about this issue in the US is that we know that at-risk species include water birds and waterfowl, but I believe that passerines are also greatly underreported and undetected. And I'd be interested in knowing others' thoughts on that as well. There has been some work done on this in the US in trying to quantify the scope. And Loss et al. In 2014, they estimate that at least 8 million birds a year are killed due to collision in North America. And what we do here to address this reactively includes marking and recently illuminating wires with ultraviolet light to make them more visible to species of concern. There are also dozens of wire markers with varying properties on the market. Some can be installed with drones and robots. So that's kind of an exciting new area. And what we also note here is that addressing the overhead static wires is particularly important, as these smaller wires have been shown to be particularly difficult for birds to see and avoid. Unlike the electrocution issues, marking wires is an imperfect solution. And what we typically find is some collisions will still persist, although reduced. And then lastly, from there, we're moving into the distribution system. And that's typically in the US about 25 kV and below. And as we start getting lower in voltage, the clearances become reduced and electrocution problems then emerge. And our problems are very different than what you're going to hear from others in Asia and Africa, in that we use a lot of wood. And wood's not a perfect insulator, but it does provide some protection. So a lot of our problems tend to be phase to phase as opposed to phase to ground. And again, the total numbers of birds lost to power electrocutions are unknown in the US, but again, Loss et al. Estimates about 0.9 million at least are killed annually in the US. And what I want to drive home here as well is that we've been working on this issue for a very long time in the US. And despite over 40 years of work on this issue, the US Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that we're still killing about 504 golden eagles annually in the US. And again, as Umberto mentioned, there are a lot of good resources available to help us do this. There's some APLIC documents on suggested practices for avian protection on power lines. But we still have a problem because there are thousands of miles of older lines in existence, and wood poles in the US can last over 60 years. There's not a coordinated national effort to fix older poles while ensuring new lines have adequate separation. And this may be a shocker to the audience, but in the US, we have over 2,000 different electric utilities. So making it very difficult to coordinate efforts. And so in terms of addressing the electrocution issue, obviously our opportunity, especially with new projects with Renewable, is building those lines with separation built in. For eagles, we use 150 centimeters of horizontal and 100 centimeters of vertical. And then for reactive measures, installing insulation and bird discouragers. And as I noted with the collector stations, you've really got to pick good products to do this. And not only do you have to pick good products, but what we have found is that it's really, really critical that the installation is done quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for your insights. Now, interesting that you were talking about the challenges in the US of the many different utility companies, because we're now moving to China. Dr. Xie Gao, who works for State Grid Corporation of China, you are actually a very large utility company, and the company manages over 1 million kilometers of power lines. So clearly you don't have this problem of too many companies and lack of coordination, but I'm sure you have other challenges. I know you are responsible for dealing with the interaction between grid infrastructure and birds, so we're really looking forward to hearing your insights from the State Grid company perspective. So could you please tell us how the interaction with birds, things like collision and electrocution, affect your company's operation, whether you see an increase in costs or specific impacts in terms of outages, and how is State Grid handling this issue?
Thank you. Firstly, I would say thank you for the invitation, giving me the opportunity to discuss this topic from a great company's perspective with all the experts here. Nowadays, China is putting a lot of effort into building an environmental friendly society. With the continuous improvement of the ecological environment and the heightened awareness of wildlife protection among people, the number of birds is increasing every year. Their habitats and activity areas are expanding, and birds-related transmission line faults have become one of the major causes of issues. The reason for transmission line trip failures caused by birds, including they build nest on the transmission tower, the nest material falling down, birds dropping, contaminating insulator, birds picking at insulators, and the birds fly across the transmission lines, leading to collisions and electrocutions. The power outage and the trip accident caused by bird damage seriously impact the power supply quality, transmission line stability, and the safety of both birds and our personnel who may need to repair the affected areas. This not only results in unpredictable losses for power grid companies and power consumption units, but also pose a threat to the lives of birds and our staff. According to the statistics from 2010 to 2019, there are more than 2,300 birds-related fault trips on high voltage lines, accounting for 10% of the total line trips. In terms of the costs, this includes expenses for repairing damaged equipment and investigating the causes of outages and implementing preventive measures. Our company takes several approaches to managing this issue. We regularly inspect our grid infrastructure to identify potential hazards from birds. Where necessary, we install bird deterrents like spikes, nets, and barriers to minimize their interactions with our equipment. We also work closely with our wildlife experts and conservation organizations to develop and improve our strategies to ensure they are both effective and humane. For example, we build artificial nests for birds to reduce their tendency to nest on transmission tower. Additionally, we raise awareness among our personnel about the importance of wildlife conservation and the specific steps if they can take to prevent bird-related incidents. So while the interaction between birds and the grid infrastructure prevent challenges, our company is committed to addressing their issues in a way that ensure the reliability of our grid can also provide wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. So let me move on to Rainer Raab. Rainer, you've been working on biodiversity conservation for decades, specifically also looking at the issues around bird species in Europe and supporting implementation of the EU Habitats Directive and Birds Directives. Can you tell us how serious the impacts of migratory birds the impact of grids and collision electrocution is on migratory birds specifically in the EU context, but I mean, you can also say some global things if you like. Can those impacts go beyond just affecting a few individual animals that interact with the infrastructure? How big is the issue, and can it have a real impact on populations?
Thanks. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you in this panel. And I'm really working since many decades, especially with the great bustard in Europe. So not only in Austria, so I'm from Austria, but I'm working in Central Europe mainly. But with other species like red kite, I'm working in whole Europe. And with all the bustard species nowadays in the not whole world, but in 4 continents. And I want to give you a short overview what is happening in Europe. And the question was really good that you asked me, because there is an influence not only for some individuals, but really depending on the species. But especially the bustards are really influenced by power grid. So there is a huge topic. Collision is the topic for the great bustard. Other species, like for example raptors, are often influenced by not only collision, so also by electrocution. We heard a lot from Umberto and a lot from Richard already. And I'm very proud that we have also some insight now to what's happening in China. And I think it's really important to understand what is the influence of power lines. So I started myself with my company and with the help of some co-workers of mine and other cooperation partner, especially the influence of power lines on migrating birds. So we had some video monitoring. We started with video monitoring on power lines in 2012, and we have a good overview what is happening when birds are crossing rivers. And there is a power line, so we can see there are a lot of collisions. And it was interesting for me to see it's not always the overhead cable. No, it's also the transmission line that can cause problems. And especially species like the mute swan has real problem with collision, but luckily he's not the most interesting species for nature conservation. But if you look on the bastards, you have a lot of influence. So populations, subpopulations are really decreasing if there are new power lines educated. And we can see that you can change something if you remove power lines again. So this is happening in Central Europe, especially with medium voltage power lines. And I'm very proud that I can tell you that in Austria, in my region where I live, in the eastern part of Austria, in Lower Austria, and Burgenland is the most eastern part of Austria, every new medium voltage power lines nowadays is built underground automatically, not only in bastard habitats, also in the surrounding habitats. Nobody was thinking about that more than 20 years before. Then we started projects financed also by life money from the European Union, and you can make the difference. And it really changed the habitat a lot. And we have an increasing population of great bastard. And this is unique in the whole world nowadays, because in the last 11 years, we lost European-wide and worldwide, we lost nearly 1 out of 3 bastards. So we lost more than 30% of the great bastard population. In our area, we managed to double the population size only because we spent a lot of effort. We did a lot of habitat management, including also burying medium voltage power lines, existing medium voltage power lines. And luckily, no medium voltage power line is now anymore built overhead. And I was really shocked, to be honest, when I visited Spain this year and last year, and I could see thousands of kilometers, also newly built medium voltage power lines, and there is no idea to change anything about that. And I think we really have to change that, because especially medium voltage or low voltage power lines are easily possible to do it as underground cable. Okay, it's costly, but it really saves a lot of lives, especially for bastards. And we have now the results of more than 3,000 decked red kites. I decked in my life as in the Life Eurokite project, more than 3,000 red kites together with more than 50 cooperation partners. And the newest results are showing us that approximately 10% of the birds that are able to fly, so not the fledglings in the nest, so the birds that really left the nest, 10% are dying through electrocution or collision with power lines. So we heard before from Umberto that this is the main topic for a lot of raptor species. In red kite, poisoning is more serious problem than electrocution or collision, because red kites are really able to fly really nicely and perfectly, but still there are happening collisions. That was also a little bit surprising, that also a bird like a red kite that can kite perfectly in the sky also has problems with the cables. And we can learn from that experiences. There is a need to do a lot of things. And we heard before from Richard, marking is not the final solution. To be honest, it can help. That's true. It can help in some cases, but we really have to avoid building new power lines in the most important areas for some the most important species that we want to protect. So I'm really, as bastard specialist, convinced that we need also power line free areas in the world to protect some of the most threatened species. And I'm doing really a lot the last decades to my part, that we have better understanding what is the need of what helps marking. Is there a chance to provide good solutions also for the energy supply companies, and not only underground cabling, but in some specific cases, it's also relevant to underground 110 or 220 kV power lines. And I think in some specific situations, also 380 kV power lines, or a minimum to avoid really protected areas and to destroy the last remaining habitats for this important species. So there is a huge influence, a huge impact on some species, not on all species, but some species are really influenced by power lines and the grid a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Heiner, for this. I guess the issue is cost in the end for a lot of countries, right? But just to check it in Austria, I mean, is there a requirement by regulation to bury those power lines?
No, there is no requirement from the law, but the companies found out that it's also cost efficient for themselves, because we have more and more problems with climate change. And it's not surprising that more and more storms are happening. And it's really better for them because we had a huge development of wind farms, and then they started to really underground all the cables, these 20 kV power lines, and they found out, yeah, it's some extra effort at the beginning, but if you see it in long term, you can also save some money. But the main aim to do it underground is really to have no risk with storms or with special weather conditions. And it's really also better for them to do it underground. I know it's very easy with medium voltage power lines. It's more complicated with 110 kV power lines or 220. But I think we can also see the example in Germany. They built huge power lines from the south to the north, parts of them really underground. Okay, there's now a huge discussion if it's really worth to do it like that because it's very costly. It costs a lot. There's a lot of discussion if it's worth to do it like that. But there are good reasons to do, especially in some protected areas, do it like that. So I don't want to tell it's not possible to build overhead power lines anymore, but I think you should really plan carefully and you can protect the birds really good if you have good planning. So I think the planning is the key and mitigation can help. So marking is useful in some specific regions. You can do it with marking, but it does not help always. So there are specific areas, it's not the whole world that you have to protect from new power lines, but you have to be really careful. And a good example from the last weeks was Uzbekistan, where there are new plans for building new power lines in bustard habitats. And they will also influence great bustard and little bustard and also bara bustard. And there's huge discussion how to avoid this problem because they want to build 350 kilometers of a new 500 kV power line. Of course, it's not easy to build a new power line without influence on the wildlife, but it's really planning is the key. And I'm very happy that BirdLife is included. BirdLife International tries to help this country as much as possible because I think planning is really the key. And Avistep is, I think, a very good tool from BirdLife International that can help with that.
Great, thanks for that. I'm moving on now to Oscar Mohale, who works for the Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa. So, Oscar, you have a program to address the negative interactions between wildlife and electrical infrastructures. Can you share with us your views on how the power grid and bird interaction affect each other in the South African or maybe wider African context? As an NGO, how do you collaborate with grid utilities to address these impacts?
Hi. Thanks, Ute. And yes, okay. I think I'm not going to go a lot into how the interactions are because I think Richard covered most of those situations. We also have similar issues that Raina has talked to, where we have the Ludwig's, the different bustard species that are affected in terms of colliding with the power lines. And I like the way that Richard put his way of how the impact is happening, looking at the different divisions, what we call divisions in South Africa, and different to other parts in South Africa. We have similar to China. We have one big utility that is managing electricity, generating, transmitting it, as well as distributing it to different customers. So it's much easier to coordinate what is happening. But I want to look at this problem from the policy things of it. We have been working in this space as the NGO with the utility for about 30 years now. That's a long time, I think. And I think at the beginning, when you really need to entrench how to address the issues with the utility, you start probably by showing them how can they save the costs, because as you mentioned, the equipment get damaged sometimes. There are claims from the landowners if a vulture, for example, dies and it ignites fire, and then it takes away all of the grazing land for a farmer. Then it comes back to you and says, well, I need 2 million rands. I don't know how much it is in USD, but it's quite a lot of money if you get lots of these, they build up for one utility. But it's also bad for public relations. So it's starting there and showing that there is this benefit that we can solve for you as a utility. And whereas as the conservation space or conservation NGOs, we are benefiting by reducing the number of red data or migratory species that will be saved in that case, that will not be electrocuted or will not be colliding. So it becomes a problem or a challenge to make this a business case in areas such as the middle of Africa, like Uganda, where you don't have electrocutions, and so you know that electrocutions may not necessarily, I'm not saying so collisions may not necessarily lead to outages or equipment damage, but they do lead to some challenges sometimes to infrastructure. The conductors might break when it collides. So I'm just saying it's easier in countries like Mozambique, South Africa, and other parts of East Africa, where you find that these issues could cause to outage and the customer is really affected, or a big substation, which is what you called a collector station, gets affected, and it's a lot of money to, even though it's insured, it's a lot of money to go and replace it. So I see what I wanted to say, that I want to talk to this as a policy level. Policy is what I see being said by managers or executives, people who are not really on the ground. But by making it available, you're making it easier for the people on the ground, or the managers that set, plans, work plans, or strategies, or guidelines. Guidelines is something that we'll talk to Jay there, because engineers is what you tell engineers. How are you gonna mitigate? How are you gonna insert this product on site? How are you gonna install it? Because it's one thing to have a product, but it's another thing to install it correctly. So I just wanted to look at this policy thing from the different life cycles that you can have. We particularly work mainly on operations type of things when you already have existing lines. And I think there the main issue is retrofitting and making sure that the lines are inspected. So, but I'm just going to take you back a little bit and say planning, as Reina mentioned, is quite important. But there's also construction once you've planned. Who's constructing? How are they doing it? And operations is where we are key. But I'll get back to all of this. And decommissioning, in some cases, you find that people are going to localized energy sources, and they don't need these long lines. And I think it may be a solution for some areas that have long lines and just serving one customer. For example, a nature reserve, where actually some of the issues might be happening and you don't pick it up because there are animals that go there and eat the carcass. But also they are so remote that there are no inspections that are happening there. If you do an inspection, you need a conservation ranger to be with you, and they happen like usually once a year. GMAT, no. So there are other things that may happen in between the inspections that you don't really see. So in terms of planning stages, I think the conservation NGOs are key in using the knowledge that we know. The size of a vulture is close to 2 meters, and that's where you should say the clearance, the electrical clearance that you need as an engineer. It's let's say maybe 50 centimeters between the live conductors, but it's not going to be relevant, that clearance for vultures. So we use the information together to come up with the structures that have the clearance that serves both the engineering issues, but also solving conservation. So there, I think the routing is quite important, using the information that we have at the conservation space. Where are the colonies? Where are the breeding sites that can be avoided during that planning stage? And as I say, making a register of what structures can you use in sensitive areas. Construction nests can be an issue there. And making sure that if you know a certain species and you avoid constructing when it's breeding, and making sure that the disturbance is minimal during that construction, and you move in, you do minimal disturbance, and you move out. And in terms of operations, that's where I have a lot of things. But for example, we have a database that is a national database, because we have one utility, and we are trying to work with other states in Southern Africa, Mozambique, Botswana, as well as Zimbabwe. We're trying to also engage through another program called African Conference of Linear Infrastructure and Ecology in Africa, to make sure that we reach out using this model that we have in South Africa to these other regions. Because as you know, we talk in migratory species. They don't know borders. They don't know political borders that we have. They may be protected in South Africa, but as they move along the other regions, they get impacted. So it's quite critical that all of the other countries also have a bird-friendly infrastructure. So as I mentioned, having that database where you can all check the history of what happened in the past, or what works, what doesn't work, because it houses all of this history of incidents, of fatalities or mortalities, if you can refer to it as that. It's quite key, and only really making sure that you address the sensitive areas, or not when and once of incidents happens, and then you or maybe a bird went into an area where it's not supposed to be, then you already take the resources that you could be saving 20 other birds for that one site where it's not likely for the bird to happen. And I think one thing that we also do is making sure that the utility sees the need of supporting research. For example, we are working on with the utility to make sure that they support the research on Ludwig's bustard, and by that research we found that actually the bustard is flying at night, for example. It's something that we found by chance by tracking these birds over a long time. We have been mitigating this bird by putting standard flappers or standard diverters that are effective for diurnal birds. And so I think by being able to study these birds for 16 years, it might not be seen as a return on investment when it happens at the beginning stages, and it takes a long time. If you have these things in the policy or the strategies or the plans or the guidelines, it really makes it easy for the resources to be made available to do this. Yeah, I think I've already spoken about decommissioning, making sure that some lines that may not be necessary for the landowners that may move to other sources and may not be may not be connected to the national grid, move those, because it's a risk for collision, even though it's not live. I think let me stop here and give other people a chance. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Oscar. We have one more person to speak in this first round. After that, we'll do another poll, but I also noticed there are quite a few questions, so we will answer some of them live, but I see the panelists have also answered some of them. But please keep the questions coming, and we'll try to come to some of them. All right, Manon, over to you. Renewable Energy Grid Initiative, Grid Initiative is a German-based NGO that brings together the energy industry and conservation NGOs. And you are looking at enabling environmentally sensitive grid development. Can you please share with us, based on your experience, how you bring together grid companies and biodiversity conservation organizations to ensure grid infrastructure is eco-friendly? What is the key to promoting collaboration between the energy sector and biodiversity NGOs?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the question, and also thank you for inviting me in this panel. We've heard quite different perspectives today in the panel, and I'm happy to come last and kind of bridge them all by talking about the importance of collaboration between all actors. So as you said, Ute, I work for the Renewables Grid Initiative, RGI. We are an NGO based in Berlin, in Germany, and our role is to facilitate collaboration between transmission system operators, or TSOs, and NGOs across Europe by fostering mutual understanding, building trust between the stakeholders, and identifying shared benefits. So this collaborative approach demonstrates how these two sectors that are very distinct, that have different interests, can actually benefit significantly from each other's perspective and expertise. RGI, we exist since 2009, so it has been a journey, but all members will now actually see tangible benefits from working together. When those two parties, so TSOs and NGOs, they recognize that they can achieve more by working together, we see on the ground a better, more impactful implementation of mitigation measures. I have a few examples. I will name one now. For example, it's in Belgium, the partnership between ELIA, which is the national TSO, and two conservation NGOs, Naturpoint and Natagoha. This partnership has led to the creation of sensitivity maps that served and still do today earlier to identify high-risk areas where mitigation measures should be applied. In France, there are the DSO, distribution system operators, Enedis, and the TSO RTE, along with one national NGO, LPO, which is the BirdLife France. They are collaborating at the moment this year to create similar maps over the whole country in France on electrocution and collision risk along distribution and transmission electricity grid. So initiative like this not only lead to tangible environmental benefits, but also positively impact public perception and public acceptance. Because the citizens, the people, they see that the energy utilities and the conservation sectors generally collaborating to and are able to collaborate to safeguard biodiversity. When if we take a broader approach at the European level, because we are a German NGO, but we work at the European level, RGI's role is to expand into advocacy and policy support. We work on position papers and technical recommendations, for example, that both reflect the needs on both the grid expansion. As we said earlier in the introduction, there is an absolute need for grid expansion if we want to tackle climate change, but also that reflects the need from the conservation community. So our members, the TSOs and the NGOs, are directly involved in the development of those advocacy position papers. And that allows them to bring their challenges, which we address by identifying shared solutions that benefits all stakeholders. So this collaborative input ensures then that our advocacy work remains relevant and rooted in real operational and environmental needs. So that was for a bit of a European perspective. And if we look at the member state level, RGI actively promotes and supports best practices that demonstrate effective collaboration and innovation. One good example was the Belgium case that I just mentioned, but there are so many other examples. And for instance, there are existing national working groups with multi-stakeholders in France, in Portugal, and they really showcase how multi-stakeholder forums can align technical expertise and conservation priorities. But there are also partnerships between TSOs and academic institutions. For example, the REN, so REN is the TSO in Portugal, the REN Biopolis collaboration, Biopolis being a scientific institution. And that really illustrates the value of connecting scientific research and industry practices. There also is projects such as the Safe Lines for Birds project, which is a life project that RGI is a partner, that really shows that this collaborative approach, as we bring together TSOs, DSOs, NGOs, and research institutes to implement effective measures for bird protection along power lines. Actually, our colleague Richard from EDM International is also a partner in this project. And through this, we will test one of their tools, the avian collision avoidance system. It will be tested for the very first time in EU. So through these initiatives, RGI fosters the exchange of knowledge, and we encourage the replication of successful practices across Europe and beyond Europe. So to sum up, RGI's approach is about creating a platform for TSOs and NGOs to listen to each other and to understand each other's perspective. And through this effective communication, we can build projects together that benefits both sectors, inspire public acceptance, public trust, and drive meaningful changes at both the EU and the member states level. And we actually truly believe that this commitment to collaborate is key to making the grid infrastructure truly bird-friendly. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Manon. So, as I already said, we are going to have 2 more polls. So can my IRENA colleagues please launch the second poll? And this one actually is specifically to anyone who's joined us from a utility or a consulting company. And we'd like to know, and this is following on from Oscar and Manon, really, how do you think environmental conservation organizations and NGOs could help you reduce the impacts on migratory birds? So if you're working for a utility, also a consultancy company who advises utilities, you have multiple choices. Reach out to work with us, produce and share best practices and case studies. You might also think putting pressure on governments to introduce more regulations is a useful way, by NGOs organizing campaigns and public awareness activities, or raising the profile of the importance of addressing the issue at international level, which is something we here at IRENA can do. So please go and pick your choices, as many as you like, and I'll just give you a few more seconds. Okay, IRENA colleagues, can we have the results? Right. Okay, the winner is producing and sharing best practices and case studies. Okay. There's quite a few people like the idea of putting pressure on government to introduce more regulations. And also raising the profile more at international level. So, okay, that's one for us, but also for NGO colleagues, it seems that best practice and case studies are very much valued as well. So we'll take note of that. Thank you to the audience for this. And then we have one final poll, number 3, please, IRENA colleagues. Okay, this one, we want to hear the audience views on the top 3 greatest barriers to reduce collision electrocution impacts on migratory birds. So you can have a maximum of 3 choices. So there's a lack of knowledge of specific locations where electrocution occurs more frequently, lack of coordination between grid planning and environmental conservation plans, lack of clear regulations and guidelines, the high cost of mitigation measures, or mitigating impacts on migratory birds, not being a near-term priority for grid companies. So again, I give you a few more seconds. Okay, IRENA colleagues, let's have the results. Right, lack of coordination seems to be the winner here, actually with 81%. So a lot of people think that's a particularly big problem. Then we have lack of clear regulations and guidelines, lack of knowledge of specific locations. Interesting that the high costs, people don't think that's a big issue. So in a way, that's kind of encouraging that it's not a cost issue because, you know, in principle, some of the other points can be addressed better. And we've heard several people here talking about how they're doing it. So thanks a lot for your insights there. What I'd like to do now, I mean, in principle, we have a second round for the panelists, but I'd actually like to pick some of the audience questions and put them back to the panelists. Now, I will leave it up to you in the panel to choose if you feel you want to answer it. But there was one very interesting one. I'm just trying to find it again, sorry. Where is it gone? There was one about, right, about climate change. And in the context of climate change, of course, there will be anticipated changes to migratory paths or maybe changes in the behavior of bird species. Are these being discussed, and how you could adapt the planning for infrastructure, or take into account these issues in the planning of infrastructure? Like, is there a mechanism in policy to look at designing for adaptive change? Does anyone have an answer to that one? Speak up if you do.
I can try, but I don't think I'll answer it completely.
That's fine, Oscar. Just give us your thoughts.
Okay, sure. I think we know that linear infrastructure in general is most susceptible to climate change. We have seen in South Africa, for example, we're getting a lot of extreme cases where transmission towers are being taken over by the floods. This is on the eastern side towards Madagascar, because it's a tropical area. So I'm not sure what in tropical regions, how they design their structures. But in this region, we have seen a few cases like that, and I think it will be really key to address that. With the utilities that we work with, well, it's not driven by us, but I know that they are working to make sure that they are improving the policy. So in terms of a policy, you need a policy that's not stagnant, but something that improves. When we work on research, for example, you make sure that that new knowledge, you use it to improve that policy. It's worked on every few years. In terms of the distribution lines, in areas where you have vultures, you would expect droughts to lead to a lot of livestock dying. So so when that happens, it might attract vultures closer to the lines that you may not necessarily, they were not necessarily, mitigated, because they were not sensitive previously. They used to be rain in that area. So we need to use models to prepare utilities that these are the areas. Yes, you've been working in these areas that we predicted they were sensitive. If I'm talking about operations here, and now this might shift, you need to start proactively looking in other areas that may emerge, because we are predicting that you're going to get droughts in these areas. Sorry for the South African pronunciation there.
Thanks, Oscar. Anyone else has got any thoughts on this question? No. Okay. Oscar, can I just ask you to maybe answer? There's a couple of questions to you in the Q&A. Maybe you could type responses to those. That'd be great. There was also one about, let me just find it again. So, and in fact, Rainer, you talked about, that for certainly in some areas, burying the medium voltage power lines is the best solution. But here is someone saying, well, this is very unlikely. Seems like he or she is from Australia, and would like really to hear about, are there any other solutions to make those birds safe, just accepting that they can't necessarily be buried? Rainer, or anyone else?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will try to answer this question. So of course, burying underground cabling is not always a solution, because it depends also on the one hand it's costly, on the other hand it depends on the soil. So of course it's not always easy, but especially in agricultural landscape, it's really not a big issue. It's different if you have mountains or something like that with stones and so on, or rivers. But what I want to tell is, yeah, of course you can also mark medium voltage power lines, but you should really think first what is better and what is more cost intensive. So because also marking costs a lot of money and does not solve everything. But I think it's clear the planning is the key. So you really need the local people, the regional people. I also want to try to answer a little bit the question before with the climate change topic. What was interesting finding that I want to tell to everybody, So we did this monitoring with the video, monitoring. What we could find out that if the flock is bigger, birds are most often are not really influenced by the power lines because they fly more or less higher. And it's easy for a bigger flock to avoid any collision. But that's on the one hand the good news for for increasing populations. It's the bad news for decreasing population because especially species that are very rare are very often flying exactly in the height of power lines, and then there is a higher collision risk. So climate change can also influence the flyways. So I'm also involved in a cost project in Europe that is called OiFlyNet. And I agree completely what Oscar is telling. So we should be really good in monitoring because it's hard to predict what will happen in 10, 20, or 30 years because everything is changing. We can also feel it, for example, for the red kite. Red kites were migrating a lot in the past, and now more and more populations start wintering in their own area. And yeah, this is an ongoing process. So it can also help to avoid collision because if they don't migrate as much as before, maybe collision risk will not be so big problem anymore. But it's not black and white. So we have really to care about, and also with underground cabling, it's not black and white. There are so many grayish the colors in between. So it's always important to look on the concrete project, and then we find the perfect solution.
And Rainer, while you're on, as you were advocating buried lines, someone asked a question about the problems around repairing buried lines, so requiring liquid nitrogen to freeze the oil for safety. Are there any new technologies and materials which can help with that?
Yeah, so that was always the argument against burying, but it's not true practically. So in theory, it can cause problems because you need more time to repair something. But practically, there is no topic at all with the medium voltage power lines till now. So the companies are very satisfied and they're doing it since 10, 15, 20 years more and more often. And if you have a good system to control it, it's no problem at all. So it's really not an issue. It's not an issue anymore because it's a technical thing and you have less influence if it's really done perfectly. So it's costly, that's true. So for example, burying a 20 kV power line costs between 70,000, 100,000 euro per kilometer, but marking with good markers costs also 15 to 25,000 euros. So it's not like nothing. And marking helps for, let's say, 5 or 10 or maybe 15 years, but surely not for 100 years. And so I think if you think in long term, burying is not always the most expensive solution. So we really have to think long term. And I think avoiding building new medium voltage power lines, if they're not really relevant as overhead, is a solution, a very good solution. And you should start thinking about it. I don't want to tell you it's necessary to do it everywhere, but you should start thinking about the possibility to do it also with 110 and 220. So I think planning is really the key because we need a lot of infrastructure in the next years and decades, and they build a lot of new cables and power lines. So we should start thinking now and not in 20 years because then it's too late.
Okay, can I just ask Tia's views on burying? Is this something that is being done by State Grid or being discussed, or what's the situation in China?
Sorry, I missed your question. Is that ask me?
Is again about this issue of burying power lines as a solution to collisions and other things like we discussed. Is this something that's being done in China?
Yes, we do a lot of measure to reduce first related instance. You want to I mean
Is it specifically about putting them underground as opposed to above ground medium voltage ones we've been discussing? Or were your lines above ground?
It's most of them is above ground, just on the top of the transmission tower, and some devices are installed on the transmission line, not on the ground.
Okay, because the discussion here was in some countries to avoid the bird collision totally, the lines being buried underground, but okay.
Yeah, I know.
If I could jump in, so I think it's really important in this conversation too, to make sure that we're making a distinction between medium voltage
Yes.
lines, and transmission lines. Because as Rainer was saying, yeah, with these medium voltage lines, the technology's here. There's some extra costs, but definitely some benefits. But when you start getting into the transmission infrastructure, your engineering challenges really ratchet up, and you really have to balance, what it is that you're trying to accomplish against those costs and challenges.
Yes, and obviously in some countries it is huge distances, like in China, for example. Okay. So one quick question here as well. Is there any substantial difference between migratory and non-migratory birds in terms of collision electrocution risk? I mean, Richard, you had talked a little bit about passerines.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been kind of mulling that one over. I guess what I can say is that when we look at outages being caused by animals due to electrocution, there is often a temporal pulse to that. So that leads me to think then it is a migratory issue. So for instance, we oftentimes see events ratcheting up in the springtime when birds are breeding and birds are migrating into the area. So I would suspect that yes, there is a difference.
Okay, thanks. And let me take one last one. Of course, everyone talks about AI these days, and I know someone will have an example here anyway. Have the panelists had experience in using advanced technologies such as computer vision, machine learning, AI to monitor or reduce environmental impacts of such infrastructure? If not, are there specific reasons why? Who would like to answer that?
Well, I'll take oh, go ahead.
Sorry, it's here. Would you like to?
I think a lot of countries do this survey, but we use AI strategy system to help us to make the strategies. For example, we have a lot of methods to reduce the birds related things, but how to choose which one is most suitable for this area for one kind of birds. So we use AI strategy system to combine the bird's activity information and the statistic on the effectiveness of various methods. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Richard, did you want to add something to that? Sorry, you're on mute. Richard, still can't hear you. Okay. Anyway, we're out of time. Time goes quickly. And I think we've had so many questions. It's really impressive to have so much audience participation. I think it does reflect the fact that we've had a lot of the audience who are already actively involved in these issues. I would like to thank all the panelists for their really insightful contributions, and really grateful to Richard and Ziad of doing it during really awkward times for you, but also thanking all the others for their contributions. I'd like to, of course, thank our partners, CMS and Raptors MOU, but also my colleague, the people behind the scenes, of course, Lauren from Raptors MOU and Zinlei from my team, as well as our IT colleagues for helping us put this together. I think we've had a really interesting discussions. discussion. And what we will do, as we always do, we will make this webinar available on our website. We are also organizing another couple of sessions. And then for anyone who's attending the IRENA Assembly, there will also be a session on the environmental impacts of renewables and grid infrastructure more broadly. So this is certainly an issue we tend to want to do more work on, because it's incredibly important in terms of, but we need to make sure that as we expand renewables and grids, that we do take impacts into account and address them and mitigate them as much as we can. So thank you again for everyone, including the audience, for their interesting questions. And we hope to see many of you at the next webinar, which we will post details about it soon on LinkedIn and other social media. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.